Chapter 4. Dave approached the highway cautiously. He went through the parking area for a school bus contractor, the silent yellow buses magnifying the sound of his steps on the gravel. He had wanted to go around, but the way was blocked by a fence and a steep gully. He approached the rear fence and dropped his pack. Taking a moment to look around and listen, he once again unsheathed his Leatherman and undid the soft aluminum ties that bound the fence to the bottom crossbar. Propping the fence open with his pack, he wriggled underneath the fence, then held the fence open and pulled his pack towards him. Gently replacing the fence, he returned the ties to their original spots and resealed the fence. He took a moment to reverse his pack cover and donned an olive green BDU top. Rebuckling his chest rig, he once again shouldered his pack and entered the woodline. About 75 yards into the woodline, he saw an open area to his front. Dropping his pack, he placed it near the base of a large pine tree. Pulling on a pair of aviator gloves, he removed a pair of small binoculars from the ammunition pouch on the right side of his pack's hip belt and then put them in his left cargo pocket. Moving with as much silence as he could, he slowly approached the cut. As he got closer, he dropped and crawled the last 10 yards, winding up under a mountain laurel bush. Below him, the empty interstate stretched like a black snake in the setting moon's light. He was right where he wanted to be, about 75 feet above the road on a cutout, an almost sheer granite face to his front. On the other side of the highway, he saw a similar face. To his left, the ground gently sloped away, and he could just see where the highway crossed the low area, resting on a built-up berm that rose about 15 feet above the surrounding terrain. He took the time to study the ground opposite him, straining for any sign of an OP. Scanning the roadway, he saw no vehicles on the shoulders and no sign or sound of anyone. Remaining where he was for an hour, the only traffic was 3 Humvees led by a state police car heading east from his left to right. The Humvees towed covered trailers and were running without light discipline. That meant, Dave said to himself, that they do not expect ambushes or hostile acts, which meant that they would not be as observant as they would if they were fighting a guerrilla war. Moving away from the road, he checked his watch. Dawn was fast approaching. He moved back and eventually found his pack. Good camo, Sergeant Chadwick, he thought as he finally found it. The sliver of moon had set, and the light of the stars lit his way. He moved to his right and dropped his pack again. Walking and kneeling frequently, he finally found a likely spot. A large pine tree with broad sweeping branches close to the ground, very near the edge of the cut, with a large fallen pine right in front of it. Retrieving his pack, he returned to the pine and crawled under the lowest branch. Using a bit of paracord and some stout dead sticks, he quickly set up his space blanket over him, shiny side down. In doing so, he hoped to avoid observation from any aircraft or road-bound vehicles equipped with thermal vision. Laying out his sleeping bag, he unstrapped the waist belt of his rig and pulled the magazines forward, allowing him to lie on his stomach comfortably. As he settled in for a long wait, the first rays of dawn streaked through the sky. He watched the road, and his thoughts drifted to the circumstances that had brought him here. David McGrath was a typical American kind of guy. 2 kids, a wife, a mortgage. He lived in a modest home in a semi-rural Connecticut and attended church weekly. He had grown up in a home broken by divorce, but had a good relationship with his father and mother, who had not let the divorce destroy their relationship with their children. Dave had a fairly typical childhood for his area. Growing up, he lived in a more rural area of the state and his farmhouse surrounded by farmland. He spent much of his free time as a youth roaming the neighboring woods, graduating from a BB gun to a pellet gun, then on his 16th birthday, a .22 rifle, the same one his grandfather and father had used. He learned to camp through his father and the Cub and Boy Scouts, and developed a lifelong love affair with wild places. Starting summer during his 14th year, he worked for Mr. Houston. The old-timer owned a farmland that surrounded Dave's house. Mr. Houston was a good man, a swamp Yankee, as they were known locally. He had only left his farm for any appreciable time once, when he spent 3 years in the Pacific babying the piston engines of Marine Corsair fighters. Like many of his generation, he had come home from the war and married his childhood sweetheart. As far as Dave knew, there had been no children, no heir to pass on the trade of farming. Mr. Houston never spoke of it, and it just wasn't something you asked someone about unless they volunteered it. Mrs. Houston was a little bird of a thing, always baking pies and cookies, and Dave and his sister had been welcome guests in her home since they were in diapers. She canned the vegetables grown in her modest kitchen garden, and they raised both a pig and a calf every year for meat. They were the closest thing Dave had to grandparents, as both sets of his has died before he was born. When Dave turned 8, Mr. Houston was complaining about the squirrels and crows destroying his garden. Dave suggested shooting them with the BB gun Mr. Houston kept behind the kitchen door. Mr. Houston put him off, saying he had too much work to do on the farm to play with rodents. Dave suggested that he find someone to do it. After considering and discarding several names, Dave finally suggested that he be allowed to do the job. Mr. Houston agreed with a twinkle in his eye, and it wasn't until years later Dave realized that he was the man Mr. Houston had been looking for the whole time. From that day forward, Dave was never outside without the BB gun. That Christmas he received one of his own from Mr. and Mrs. Houston, and the next summer he started getting rewarded for his efforts. 3 ears of corn per squirrel and 2 for each crow. When he started working for Mr. Houston around the farm, Dave learned much about life. The birth of dairy cows, how to tell if an udder was infected, and mechanics by working on the battered Ford pickup that was the farm's workhorse, and the several old tractors Mr. Houston kept around the place. During the school year, he rose early and helped with the morning milking, and grew to love the early morning smells and sounds. Every summer he did take a break, though. His Uncle Tom was a history teacher at the local community college, and house sat for one of his friends every 6 weeks in the summer, when his old roommate took his summer trip to Europe. Dave would go for 1 to 3 weeks to stay with his family, spending his days at the Loner Beach House, swimming in the Atlantic, and boating on Long Island Sound. Dave's uncle was a major military history enthusiast and collected many historical firearms and replicas. He would take Dave to his cabin in New Hampshire once or twice a year, and they would spend the weekend shooting them. Cap and ball revolvers, flintlock and percussion muskets and rifles, lever-action Winchesters, and his uncle's trapdoor Springfield. Dave's favorite was the M1 carbine an old man had given his uncle. Despite his uncle's best effort, Dave developed a taste for modern magazine-fed arms. Eventually his uncle gave him a carbine, saying it was about 50 years ahead of his interest anyway. Eventually, his uncle took a position with a large local college in New Hampshire, and Dave visited him often as he could until his untimely passing due to the effects of Agent Orange exposure. Dave graduated from high school at 18, and while not a stellar student, was able to get into the state university that was about 50 miles from his home. He attended school for 2 years and studied history and finance and joined the ROTC. During his summer camp for ROTC, Dave received a taste of military life. All of the adult males of his family had served in the military in one capacity or another, except for Uncle Rich. Dave suspected his uncle's lisp and feminine ways were more than an act put on for the draft board. In fact, Dave could trace military service from members of his family going back to the Mexican War, and he had relatives on both sides of the Civil War. For all of his effort, Dave didn't enjoy college. He dated a couple of girls, but found the majority to be shallow and vain, interested more in parties and social circles than anything of substance. Dave started to think of dating them as defiling infidels and started to re-examine his own life. This decision led him to enlist in the Army in the spring of his sophomore year. He told his mother that weekend when he went home, much to her surprise. She was counting on Dave going to school and becoming successful. Mr. Houston was happier with his choice. "Glad to see you doing something useful," he said in his gruff way. Dave could tell he was bursting with pride. Sitting around all day and listening to panty-waisted professors yakking about things they have no real experience with is a good way to get a pedigree, but no way to learn about life. You keep your mouth shut and do what they tell you, and you'll do fine. And drop Mrs. Houston a note from time to time. She'll be worried sick about you." Dave smiled. That was the most affection Mr. Houston had ever overtly displayed to him. His semester ended, but Dave's thoughts were on the summer. He had 2 weeks from his last final exam until he reported to the MEP station for his processing. He spent most of that time working around the farm. Mr. Houston was getting long in the tooth, and Dave had a lot to do around the farm before he left for Fort Benning and infantry school. Dave eventually graduated from infantry school and went directly to Airborne school across post. Jumping out of planes was as exciting and as awesome as he had hoped. He got his orders in the first week of jump school, Korea. He was both intrigued and apprehensive. He spent the next 2 weeks trying to find out what Korea was like, but the rumors that floated among the initial entry soldiers contained more false information than a Clinton press release. Service in Korea turned out to be better than he expected. Here was real soldiering. As part of an air assault battalion, Dave spent much of his time humping a large rucksack up and down the numerous yamas, or hills, in the land of the morning calm. Dave eventually wound up as a machine gunner by his own insistence. He loved firing the big 23-pound M60 and being an important part in his platoon's organic firepower. Also, being able to hump the pig while heavily burdened and in a country with little flat ground gave one a little more bragging rights than the ordinary guy had. 2 months before his tour ended, he got new orders, Fort Bragg. "All right," said Dave to his roommate. 82nd Airborne, here I come." Dave was excited about the prospect of joining America's Honor Guard. They had a reputation as a fierce fighting unit, and certainly he stood a better chance of seeing some interesting deployments. When Dave arrived at Fort Bragg and checked in the reception station, he talked to a sergeant who was waiting, like Dave, for orders to a unit within a division. "It's like this," the sergeant began. "When you get to your battalion, you'll be assigned to a company. The day you get your orders, take a walk to the battalion area and talk to the guys. Find out which company has the best reputation, then talk to the first shirt or the CO, and let them know you're being assigned to the battalion, and due to the company's reputation, you want to go with them. When you get to battalion HQ the next day, they will usually send a runner up to grab you from the staff pogues, and you'll get the assignments you want." Dave took the advice to heart, and when he got orders for the 504th Infantry, he did just that. Putting on his best BDUs and his newly issued maroon beret, he walked over to the battalion headquarters and asked the CO where he could find the scout platoon. The CO took Dave to the door and pointed out recon's area to him. Dave thanked him and smiled. Looked like where he wanted to be. Above the door was a large hand-painted sign, a black field with a gleaming white skull grinning down at him. The sign boldly claimed, "Where mortal man fear to tread, recon leads the way." He knocked on the door. A smiling black face soon opened it. "What you want, troop?" asked the soldier, a specialist by his collar insignia. "I'd like to speak to the platoon leader or platoon sergeant," said Dave. The soldier grinned. "Looking for a job?" Dave nodded. "Well, this is the place. Lieutenant Moore and Sergeant Chadwick are really cleaning house. If you aren't squared away and strack as Audie Murphy, you won't stand a chance. You just in from Benning?" Dave shook his head. "Alpha 1503rd, second ID. The smile grew broader. "First Rock. I was in Charlie Company in '92. I'm Williams. Come on. The platoon sergeant will want a guy used to humping the rock." Dave was promptly introduced to Sergeant First Class Wesley Chadwick. Dave was slightly intimidated by the sergeant. He had more patches on his uniform than Dave had ever seen. Drill sergeant, pathfinder, jump wings with a star, indicating a combat jump, combat infantry badge, Special Forces combat patch on his right shoulder, Ranger and Special Forces tab. "PFC McGrath requests permission to speak to the platoon sergeant," said Dave from his best parade rest. "Speak," rumbled Sergeant Chadwick. "Sergeant, I report to battalion tomorrow, and I would like to be assigned to the scout platoon." Chadwick looked at him. Jump wings. Reasonably fit. Didn't sound like an idiot. You a college boy? Asked Chadwick. No, Sergeant, I'm a soldier, replied Dave. But I did attend college before I wisened up. Chadwick considered him again. Troop, that makes you a college boy. Can you type? No, Sergeant, no more than hunt and peck. That's the right answer. Where are you coming from, Benning? No, Sergeant, Alpha 1503rd 2nd ID, Korea. What'd you do there? Walk point in the Z, then hump to 60. Why'd they let a cherry walk point? I grew up hunting in the woods and am good in the woods. Country boy? As much as a Yankee can be. You use a radio? Yes, Sergeant. I was an RTO for a short time, but I really wanted the 60, so my platoon leader squared me away. What's your GT score? 125. Last PT score? 322. Can you swim? Yes, Sergeant. How well? I spent a few weeks every summer at the beach, so well enough. Like jumping? Well, Sergeant, the first 5 were pretty cool. Williams laughed. Cherry, he said, in a derisive term for new jumpers. That's enough, Williams, said Chadwick. You were a cherry not too long ago yourself. Williams looked away, embarrassed to be chastised by his well-respected sergeant. Come by before you report to battalion tomorrow. I'll ask Lieutenant Moore to go up and grab you before the staff weenies make you a combo section chief. We'll look at your file and make sure we want you, but based on what I've heard, we'll try you out. If you can't hang or you're an idiot, or if the platoon doesn't like you, you're gone to a line company. Got it? Loud and clear, Sergeant, answered Dave. His face glowed. Recon. Better not screw this up, boyo, he thought. Get out of here, said the sergeant. Williams walked into the door. See you tomorrow. You're going to love it here. This platoon is kick-ass. It's a lot like the ROTC. We train hard, but they give us less BS and more high-speed training. The platoon is going to rough terrain jump school in 6 weeks. You'll get a couple more jumps before you go. In 4 months, JOTC in Panama, and we'll be in the field pretty much the whole time until then, except for RTJ school. Dave thanked him and headed back to the reception barracks. One more day to kill before the fun started. The next morning was spent out processing the reception company and reported to Battalion HQ with 7 other men about 11:30 a.m. He managed to get over to recon by saying he needed the Hitler latrine, and he told Williams he was going to Battalion HQ. As he stood in line, a short first lieutenant came out of a door to the right. Okay. I'm Lieutenant Kastner, and I'll be assigning each of you men to the unit. Any NCOs? One man, an E6, raised his hand. Lieutenant Kastner pointed. Go on in, Sergeant, and Specialist Gomes will take care of you. The sergeant nodded, and picking up his small backpack, left the group. Lieutenant Kastner called the remaining junior enlisted men to attention. You men are about to join the 82nd Airborne Division, the most powerful force projection organization in the United States Army. Before I hand out your assignments, is anyone here not 11 Bravo? 11 Bravo is a MOS for infantrymen in the Army. No hands went up. Okay, anyone here type? Again, no hands. Anybody have college? No hands. The lieutenant looked at the man next to Dave. What's your GT score, he demanded. GT score is like a military IQ test. The man swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing like a dangled orange. 109. 109 what? Asked Carter. 109, sir, barked the soldier. And yours, he said, turning to Dave. 86, sir, lied Dave. He didn't want to type for anyone. Kastner went down the line asking every man the same questions. He then had the men turn in their records, which they were carrying from their last post. He handed them to a clerk behind the desk as Sergeant Chadwick walked in. Can I help you, Sergeant? Asked Kastner in a condescending tone. I'm all set, LT, he said, pronouncing each letter of the abbreviation separately. Just picking up my new man. McGrath, grab your shit and come with me. Wait a second, Sergeant, ordered Kastner. I'm not through with that man. You've got his folder. You've tried to steal him for your office staff. You're done, said Chadwick. We've got to get him settled. The platoon is jumping the day after tomorrow. Why was I not informed of this jump? Asked Kastner. He tried to get on as many lifts as he could, and was not beyond screwing up a training mission just so that he could get in one jump. It's a training jump for the platoon, sir, and you're not in the platoon, answered Chadwick honestly. And you are not in my chain of command, so I have no reason to inform you, sir. Let's go, McGrath. "You stay right there, Specialist," ordered Kastner. Dave stopped. "This man goes where I say he goes, and when. Sergeant, step into my office." The lieutenant turned on his heel and walked away. Chadwick turned to Dave and said, "Grab your stuff and go to the platoon CP. I'll get this straightened out." And he followed the young lieutenant through the door. Dave heard the shouting start as he left the HQ building. He collected his bags and went down to the CP, where he introduced himself to Lieutenant Moore. He told Lieutenant Moore what was happening, and Lieutenant Moore hustled over to the battalion to see what he could do. Dave wound up spending 5 years at Fort Bragg, all of it in the scout platoon. He left as a sergeant E5 and would have had staff sergeant had he re-enlisted. He had decided the Army wasn't for him after deploying to a peacekeeping mission in a squalid third world African nation. As had played out so often in the past, order was restored soon after the arrival of American troops. But as the Democratic administration in Washington vacillated on its policies, the rebels grew bolder, stealing food convoys and murdering civilians with almost free will. As the situation deteriorated, the Americans were finally pulled out, having been prevented from accomplishing anything of substance by an administration fearful of any risk to American lives or European sensibilities. Dave and the platoon had discussed the operation at length during the months following their stand-down, and all of them agreed that they would have risked their lives to fight for the poor, starving wretches they had seen on the roads and in their refugee camps. A person would have to have lost all his sense of humanity not to be touched by the misery and suffering they had borne witness to, and they all felt let down that they were not encouraged to unleash their anger on the savages responsible for it. They were ashamed, too, that their government would build up the hopes of so many innocent people and then abandon them to almost certain death. Dave returned home and got a small apartment, starting attending college at night. He worked full-time in a hardware store and visited his mother and the Houstons nearly every weekend. He eventually returned to a normal school schedule and finished his degree. He started working for a large insurance company, training new employees. He liked the work. It was a little like dealing with new soldiers, and he had a lot of freedom in his job. He eventually was promoted to a management position, and it was interesting enough that he didn't feel boredom creep up on him very often. It was through this job that he met his wife Sandy, a computer programmer at his firm. They dated for a few months and kind of drifted apart, and drifted back together nearly a year later. They married when they were both 33 years old. She was the child of a lawyer father and homemaker mother, and had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. She was a little more liberal a woman than Dave had ever envisioned marrying, but other than politics, they enjoyed many of the same activities and were very compatible and very much in love. Dave's activities that sometimes caused strife in his home were his habit of keeping quite a bit of canned food on hand. He eventually put together a mountain of dehydrated food, enough to feed 6 people for up to a year by his calculations. His wife didn't understand his preoccupation with storing ammunition, clothes, and medical supplies either. Dave finally told her all the gory details of what he had seen in Africa, and she lightened up on him, although he still bore reluctance to the idea that she was living above a supply dump. Her mind would not allow her to believe that there was any real chance of famine and social breakdown happening in America. Dave still shot as often as he could. It was at his local range he bumped into a man of about his own age shooting a .45 into a bank of 3 targets. He drew from the holster, fired 6 shots, reloaded, and fired 6 more. Dave recognized the El Presidente drill, and when the shooter turned around, he was wearing a ball cap with the words Ranger across the front. "Hiya, Ranger," said Dave by way of greeting. "Nice speed on the El Presidente." "Thanks," said the stranger. "You military?" "I was in the 82nd for a few years. How about you?" "I left the 82nd when I went to 2nd Battalion, then to 5th Group. Got out a few years ago. What battalion were you with?" "Recon, 1504th. "Really? I was Recon 2505th. They fell into a discussion about when they had served and where they had deployed, and it turns out they had been briefly introduced at rough terrain jump school when Dave's platoon had arrived and the stranger's platoon was leaving. "Jim Bowen," said the stranger, extending his hand. "Dave McGrath," said Dave. They talked for a while and found that they had run across many of the same people while in service. Jim's memory of names and places impressed Dave. Dave's knowledge of firearms impressed Jim. That afternoon, they became fast friends. Jim and Dave started their own social group. One of Dave's friends from high school and college, Scott, moved back to town after living and working abroad for several years. He too was an average shooter and a survivalist. Jim's brother Rob often joined them, and there were several other local shooters who joined them for shooting, cookouts, and weekend camping trips. When Jim moved to New Hampshire to escape Connecticut's ever-expanding socialist government, he urged Dave to move there too. But Sandy was adamant about staying in Connecticut where her parents lived. Eventually, most of Dave's circle made the move north too. While Dave's uncle had passed away while Dave was in the Army, he had left Dave his small cabin where they had gone shooting so long ago, along with all of his firearms. Dave wound up selling most of the guns to provide a nice annuity which he presented to his widowed aunt. Dave kept the house as a vacation retreat, and as he and Sandy had children, they built on small additions. They put on space for a larger bedroom and expanded the living room, as well as adding a one-car garage with a playroom for the kids over it. Dave had his friend Steve assist with most of the work. Steve was a local man who fit in nicely with the Connecticut crew that had moved north. With his help, Dave dug the basements and poured the foundations for additions. Also with Steve's aid, he completely enclosed the basement of the garage in concrete, reinforcing the ceiling, putting in extra drainage, and actually drilling a well in the far corner. There was a reinforced doorway going up to the garage, which was hidden in the back of a small broom closet upstairs via a large steel door in the basement. Over the next several years, Dave moved most of his storage food up there and kept a number of guns, ammo, and medical supplies there. He bought as many off-paper guns as he could afford and put them up. He became a licensed ham radio operator and through ham flea markets picked up a good base station and several portable models. He attended an EMT course at a local community college to improve his medical skills. He had taken the Combat Lifesaver course at Bragg twice, but felt that the EMT course would serve him for civil emergencies. Dave's sons, Thomas and Patrick, were born 3 years apart. They were typical boys, and Dave and Sandy were kept very busy with them. They took frequent camping trips and canoed, biked, and hiked locally. The boys also played Little League and soccer, neither of which Dave really knew much about. Dave and Sandy were both active as Cub Scout leaders, and the children attended the school run by their local parish. Dave and Sandy both agreed that public education was not acceptable in their area. Dave watched the slow decline of Pax Americana for years. The steady slide of America into socialism was unmistakable. Every year, more money flowed out of the public coffers and into the pockets of the lazy welfare recipients who merely had to vote for the same candidates to keep the payments coming. The virtual elimination of the southern border with Mexico created a situation where millions of illegals entered the country and funneled billions back to Mexico without paying taxes. The Southwest became flooded with Spanish-speaking persons who insisted that the American Southwest was theirs. No politician with the courage to speak the truth was quickly branded a racist, insensitive moron by the fifth column national press. The few true constitutionalists in the House and Senate were too few to stem the building tide of oppression that socialism inevitably brings, but they battled boldly on for as long as they could. As the U.S. government funded its ever-increasing programs, President Hillary had finally nationalized health care. It increased its reliance on foreign money. Foreign governments invested heavily in U.S. government debt obligations, backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. This meant, of course, that it had the power to tax people dry to pay the foreign governments back. He took comfort in the fact that he and his family could hole up in their cabin and be warm, dry, and safe. Dave and his friends had many theories about what was happening than there were stars in the heaven. Steve maintained it was an Illuminati conspiracy. Other plots involved the Masons, the former Soviet Union, or punishment from God. Dave figured it was laziness and a bad education system. They all agreed upon one thing, that there was something rotten in Denmark, and they weren't going to abandon the constitutional republic without a fight. They made group buys of stores as well as individual buys. They cached supplies all over their area, made plans for security, commo, and medicine. They frequently trained as a military unit and used local IDPA 3-gun and practical rifle matches as a ground to test their performance. After a terrorist attack left Dave without power for a week, he convinced his wife just how tenuous America's hold on civility was. The next time a power station was destroyed by fire, it was held to be eco-terrorist. Dave was out of power for 2 weeks. Dave was then able to convince his wife they needed to invest in a small generator that they could also take north with them to power the cabin, as winter storms were known to leave their mountain home without power too. Dave managed to help his friends purchase a 300-gallon gasoline tank, which they all filled. The gas was rotated annually and was also treated for long-term storage.